Number 10. Evolve. Evolve revolves around the basic idea that one player plays a big monster, while the other players are soldiers trying to hunt down and kill it before it can evolve to become stronger. Once it's strong enough, the player controlling the monster will either try to wipe out the hunters or complete an objective. It sounds great in theory, but sadly the game was a flop due to the developers not adding enough content to the game, and it not being able to retain players' attention after its launch. The game's hype before launch came from the developers giving beta codes to pretty much everybody, so anybody with a computer could try it and see how it was. After its release though, people realized the game didn't change at all outside of bug patches. It was all the exact same content they had seen in the beta, effectively making the launch pointless. Also, the fact that the game ran off of one single game mode didn't bode well for some players even before the launch. As a result, the game petered out pretty quickly and died. Well, Evolve still has a small player base, but frankly it's not large enough to justify Evolve being relevant. Number 9. Telltale's Game of Thrones. Telltale's Game of Thrones was expected to be another home run for Telltale, especially since their great success with the Walking Dead franchise, but it didn't live up to fans' expectations. According to fans, the game's story was mildly interesting, but most players felt disinterested very quickly. Episode 1 was a bit of a disappointment for fans, but they still had high hopes for the rest of the game. Of course, it wouldn't be on this list if Telltale had delivered. Without spoiling the story, in summary, the characters brought in from the show and the books were invulnerable, really making a majority of the choices in the game fundamentally useless, because the characters couldn't die. This led to a large amount of cliffhangers ending in disappointment, and the game being plagued by constant plot holes. Suffice to say, if you are a large fan of either the books or the show, it might be best to steer clear of this title if it hasn't already disappointed you. Number 8. The Order 1886. The Order 1886 will most likely go down in history as one of Sony's biggest mistakes, considering they thought it was a great idea to market it as one of their biggest launch titles for the PS4. The story of the game can be compared to the black bars that stood in the way of your view, being that it was obnoxious and constantly getting in the way. Among the endless amount of cutscenes to string together the game, you'd probably find a picture of the Order 1886 in the dictionary next to the phrase "on rails," seeing as there was little to no exploration on the game. In fact, there was a little game in the game, with the total playtime being around 6 hours, and over half that composed solely of cutscenes. The key reason this game was a disappointment was because, as mentioned before, it was supposed to be the big game for the launch of Sony's new console, but instead led to people desperately wanting refunds, and others being glad they didn't even buy the PS4 on launch. Number 7. Alone in the Dark Illumination. Alone in the Dark Illumination was supposed to be the revival of the old franchise, Alone in the Dark, a classic survival horror game from which many people have fond memories of pissing their pants. Alas, it was not to be. This game goes against its first principle by the fact that you were neither alone nor in the dark. No, instead of a survival horror game, it is a co-op shooter. Before release, people were really hoping to go back to a game that would bring nothing but fear and nostalgia, but instead were greeted with textures that looked like they were found on Google Images, and clunky gameplay that might have made people wish they were dead, or worse. A moment of silence for all the poor souls who pre-purchased the game because they're the ones who really suffered. They shouldn't have tried to resurrect this franchise, as it was peacefully resting in people's minds as a great game from history. Now, the best we can hope for is that this game, and the series, will die alone in the dark. Number 6. Fallout 4. Fallout is a very well-known and very highly respected franchise. Famous even prior to being purchased by Bethesda, Bethesda's Fallout 3 and Obsidian's Fallout New Vegas brought the series to new heights and guaranteed its spot on the list as one of the best RPG series ever made. When the long-awaited Fallout 4 was announced, the world collectively lost it. When we say long-awaited, we mean it. It was equal playing field with Half-Life 3, in the belief that it would never be released. The game was marketed perfectly, and people truly believed it would be the game that everyone, everywhere was waiting for. Finally, when it was released, people were saddened to realize that it didn't quite live up to the expectations everyone had. Not to say the game was bad. In fact, it is quite fun to play. Many fans agreed that the game was missing features that were long-standing staples of the Fallout franchise, and hardcore fans were less than happy. Without going into too much detail, it can be summarized that Fallout 4 was not a bad game per se, but it was not a good Fallout game, and left many players wanting much more. Number 5. Assassin's Creed Unity. The game franchise that many people might feel has long since passed its expiration date, Assassin's Creed, which at this point is released as often as Call of Duty, came out with a brand new flagship title. Assassin's Creed Unity. Assassin's Creed Unity was set during the French Revolution in the great city Paris. Gamers were excited over a brand new location and atmosphere, but that excitement quickly passed following the game's release. After launch day, it was apparent to many that Unity was in no respect anywhere near finished. The game was riddled with bugs, some game-breaking, others a bit off-putting. The most notable of which being the faceless floating eyes and mouths that plagued the game's cutscenes due to facial rendering issues. Unity became an utter flop of a game, and many eyes cemented the Assassin's Creed franchise as nothing more than a money grab. People really had high hopes for Unity, as the game before it, Black Flag, had pleased and delighted so many. Luckily, the following game, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, was released to much higher reviews, and a much lower amount of terrifying facial bugs. Number 4. Batman Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight. Where to begin with this one? A great game by all respects, as long as you didn't try to play it on PC. It was long awaited by many to be a closing chapter to Batman's Arkham franchise, and even broke several sales records for pre-orders. When it finally came out, most console players were pleased with the game and the story across both platforms. PC players, on the other hand, were met with a game that a majority couldn't even run, and when it finally did boot up, it would either crash minutes later or be downright too buggy to play. The PC launch was so horrible, many consider it as one of the worst PC ports of all time. Arkham Knight disappointed so many players that the vast majority who purchased it on Steam refunded the game for their money back. Steam was processing so many refunds that Arkham Knight was pulled off the market. Knight stayed off the market for several months until a large patch was released and sales were once again opened, for a still broken game. To this day, Arkham Knight is still virtually unplayable on Steam and might as well be seen as a console exclusive. The game is great otherwise, but has lost a lot of sales and a large portion of fans due to this train wreck release. Number 3. Halo 4 and 5. Halo is probably one of the most known and successful franchises in gaming. Many gamers were tentative after Bungie jumped ship on the franchise, and the rights for the next Halo game were given to 343 Studios. 343 Studios announced another 3 games to be released for the franchise, giving many gamers high hopes for the series. I mean, it is Halo after all. It has so much good story to it, and so much lore for them to build off of. Following the release of Halo 4, fans cried out, claiming that the story was a giant disappointment and that the gameplay felt watered down. Not to mention the multiplayer felt boring and repetitive. Still though, fans had hoped that Halo 5 could still bring back the old feel of Halo, make things right. Again, fans had their hopes torn apart. Another disappointing story with non-traditional gameplay that made the majority of dedicated Halo fans drop the franchise. At this point, the best anyone can hope for is that Halo 6 doesn't kill the franchise forever. Who knows, after the 2 previous lackluster releases, maybe at this point it would be a mercy kill. Number 2. Watch Dogs. What was wrong with Watch Dogs? Besides everything. Well, to be specific, the game was able to be a disappointment without actually being broken. There were glitches here and there, but the key problem lay in the cliché story and unimpressive game systems. Originally, before the game's release, Watch Dogs was advertised to have amazing high-quality textures, cool lightwork, and an impressive idea of a world where you could hack literally everything available to you. None of these came to fruition. Instead, players were met with average quality graphics and a very limited hacking system, built on the crutch of an unappealing crafting and skill tree need to make the hacks. According to most, when you actually used the hacks, it felt very unintuitive and underwhelming. Almost like hacking was a last-minute feature, even though the game's whole concept was born from it. On release, the game at full price was about $70, but in almost no time at all, it began to drop. At its absolute lowest, the game was only $9 in stores. Oh, but don't get us wrong, even at $9, many critics say the game still isn't worth buying. And the story isn't worth the pain and suffering of the boring gameplay. Number 1. Star Wars Battlefront. When this game was announced right next to the new movies, we would be lying to say we weren't just a little bit excited. Star Wars Battlefront was the revival of the long-dead franchise it once was. The series was known to contain some of the best Star Wars games ever released, featuring enjoyable single-player as well as several highly replayable multiplayer game modes. The games were famous for allowing players to use pretty much all of the machines and weaponry found in the Star Wars universe to manipulate and master the battlefield. Star Wars Battlefront, as released by DICE in 2015, was missing more than a few features that were very prominent in the previous games. This already left a lot of people disappointed, but they still had hope that the new features DICE was adding would live up to the hype. Again, disappointment hits hard, because when fans finally got their hands on the game and realized that the Jedi system was so underwhelming and boring, The game faced enough ridicule to destroy almost any game's credibility. At this point, we feel it is pretty fair to say that if we live life with a little bit lower standards, maybe that might lead to less disappointment. Because as these games prove, any game franchise can fail.